Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar by the Ideas Network 2030. My name is Vinay Raniga. I'm a former political leadership scholar here at the University of Oxford, and I ran last year in the general election in Oxford, Western Abingdon for the Conservatives. I'm very grateful to be here having this conversation with Douglas McNeill, OBE. But before we start, just a quick announcement about the Ideas Network 2030. The Ideas Network started in 2020 with a vision for what the long-term vision for the economy, for geopolitics, for sustainability, for digital, for infrastructure, all looking to 2030. But now we're really looking to 2040. We know right now in the UK what happens when you don't have a plan for the economy, for housing, for energy, for infrastructure. So we have to get started now to think about the bigger ideas of where the UK and Europe go moving forward. The Ideas Network is an informal network, and we have many webinars and sessions all leading up to a summer university next year in 2026. And these ideas will inform the future of the center-right. So we'd love for you to join more of our sessions, and we'll send regular emails about our future sessions moving forward. It's my great pleasure to introduce Douglas McNeill, OBE. I first met Douglas in Woodstock, in Oxfordshire, where we were campaigning, knocking on doors. And sometimes when you're campaigning in politics, you don't realize who's around you and who you're talking to. So there was a small group of us, and I asked Douglas, I'd never met him before. I said, "Oh, Douglas, what do you do?" And he said a few things. He didn't really say this, but I'm going to use it as an excuse. He was very humble. He just said, "Yeah, I work for the sometimes a bit number 10. You know, I've been working for the Conservative Party for a long time." He was very humble, but I'm going to use this excuse to introduce him as what he may have said if it was more formal. What he may have said is, Douglas may have said that currently he's working for Macro Advisory Partners, looking at global economic outlook. But prior to that, he was a chief economic advisor to UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and served as a special advisor to the Prime Minister Theresa May and Boris Johnson. He was also with Mr. Sunak as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 2020. He's an expert in fiscal policy and trade and international economic relations, and that's gone through 8 budgets, 7 spring-autumn statements, and 3 general election campaigns, along with G20 summits, IMF meetings, and FTA negotiations. So we can't be in better company to understand today about trade and the economy. And today we're really diving deep into what's going on in the UK economy, what's happened in the past, what's going on right now in the present, and looking forward to the future. What is the future of the UK economy, and how can we go for growth? So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Douglas McNeill.
Vinny, thanks very much. That's a very kind introduction, and it's great to be with you. Great to have the chance to talk to you all this evening. I want to start by setting the scene a bit, by talking a bit about the position of the public finances, and talking a bit about the constraints and the headwinds that we face. And then after that, we will come on, as Vinay suggests, and talk a little bit about the possibilities for growth and the things that we might be able to do to promote that growth. I'll start with Andy Burnham, who has just given an interview to the New Statesman. And in it, he has said, amongst other things, that the Labour government needs to get away from this thing where we are in hock to the bond markets. This thing where we are in hock to the bond markets, that's what he said. And I think he's probably not the only person in the Labour Party who thinks that they have gone too far in the direction of fiscal responsibility. And perhaps he's not the only person in the country who thinks that a little more widely. I often speak to people who wonder whether government deficits really matter as much as all that. And they sometimes say, you know, we've had a deficit for as long as one can remember. It is, in fact, nearly 25 years since the UK last ran a budget surplus for a couple of years under Gordon Brown. And they are pretty ubiquitous internationally. Almost all leading economies around the world these days run a fiscal deficit. I think the only significant exceptions to that rule are Norway and Switzerland. And so people sometimes say to me, look, if deficits are so common here and if they are so common abroad, then perhaps we should worry less about them. Perhaps we should embrace that sort of view that Andy Burnham seems to take, that being dictated to by the bond markets is a bad and unwise idea. Well, I can very well remember 20th March 2020. That was the day that we announced the coronavirus job retention scheme, the furlough scheme as it came to be known. And that scheme was announced by Rishi Sunak in a press conference at about 5 p.m., 5:30. And earlier that day, a government gilt auction, government bond auction, failed. The government stepped into the bond market, as it did a couple of times a week, looking to borrow money, and the markets would not lend all the money that we were looking for. That's an extremely unusual, virtually unprecedented occurrence. Bad at the best of times, particularly bad when you're about to launch something like the furlough scheme, an enormous, virtually open-ended spending commitment. After some discussion, we decided to proceed with the furlough scheme, and that was the right decision. The problem in the gilt market passed, and the following week we were able to borrow again as normal. But for me and for others who were involved, including Rishi, who has spoken a little bit about this, that was an extremely stressful moment, as you might imagine, a moment where it really seemed that we might have come to the end of the country's credit and means of financing itself. Now, you may say that that was an exceptional circumstances, and so it was, but it really brought home to me the fact that we are reliant on the bond markets, whether we like it or not. And that is simply reality. And maintaining the favour of the bond markets, maintaining our good standing, our credit rating in the eyes of the bond market, is often harder than it looks. I know that from the outside, the Treasury looks like a kind of all-powerful entity, all-powerful organisation sitting at the heart of the British government, controlling the economy, controlling the purse strings, exercising its sway over almost every aspect of government policy. But when you sit inside the Treasury, or for that matter, number 10 as an economic policymaker, it doesn't quite feel like you are all-powerful, because you are challenged every day by a number of things. Firstly, you are challenged by the knowledge that the tax revenues you have budgeted for are not guaranteed to occur. There's no law of economics or physics that says the tax revenue has to flow in as you have budgeted, and sometimes, for whatever reason, it doesn't. The other factor is that on an almost daily basis, you're assailed by requests, demands even, for government spending that you haven't budgeted for. And often these are very good causes, things that one would like to support. But it isn't possible to favour all of them without losing control of the finances and ultimately compromising our good standing in the eyes of the bond market. And there's a topical case at the moment arising in the West Midlands where Jaguar Land Rover is in some difficulty owing to this cyber attack, and pressure is growing for the government to assist, if not JLR, then some of the smaller companies that are in its supply chain and which are experiencing cash flow difficulties as a result. So you've always got to be kind of juggling and managing these factors. And it certainly doesn't feel like you're in an all-powerful position, because the politics of these things can sometimes overwhelm the public spending, public finance control aspects of them. I've talked about maintaining our good standing in the bond market, and that's of vital importance. But I think deficits matter for another reason as well. And that is that they have distributional impacts. What do I mean by that? Well, when the government borrows, when it amasses a stock of debt, it has to pay the interest on that debt. And it does so by taxing people. And tax is paid by the majority of people, certainly almost everyone who is working, and some of those who are not working. And that money is then funneled to the bondholders. And to some extent, the bondholders are the same people. They are taxpayers by a different name. But they do tend to be the more affluent of the taxpayers, the people who have been able to save and invest. Not everyone is in a position to do that to any great extent. And of course, some of the bondholders are overseas. They are foreign central banks, perhaps, or hedge funds in New York, or life insurance companies in Japan, or something. So that's money that goes overseas. So you get this distributional tension. Money is going from taxpayers to a subset of taxpayers, and to some extent overseas. And that's all right within reason. But if you get too much borrowing, if you have a deficit too much of the time and it's too big, then the pressure on taxpayers to fund the interest will become onerous. People will start to notice. They don't run computer models, economic models in their heads, of course, but they will start to notice. And to some extent, I think that's the position that we find ourselves in at the moment, with government interest costs running at well over £100 billion a year. Whereas 5 years ago or so, before the pandemic, when borrowing was lower, that was only about £40 billion. So it's gone up by something like £2,500 or £3,000 per taxpayer. It's not surprising that that's noticeable. So I think there is therefore agreement more or less across the political spectrum, including on the left or the centre left, that it would be good if government could reduce its spending. How might we do that? In the 1980s, we managed to do it quite successfully. The Conservative government did it quite successfully. So we're talking about 1982, 83, through the major years, and even into the early Blair administration. But we did benefit from a couple of big tailwinds which aren't available to us now. The first of those was defence spending was on the way down as the Cold War drew to a close. And the second positive factor, the second tailwind, was that in a decade in which inflation was brought under control, was tamed, interest rates came down as well. They came down by a lot. And so the government's interest bill fell by about 2 percentage points of GDP. And the same was true of defence spending. That also fell by about 2 percentage points of GDP. So the government had an extra 4 percentage points of GDP to play with. And in today's terms, that is something like £120 billion, maybe close to £130 billion. So if we had advantages like that today, we'd be in good shape. The £30 billion black hole that the government is rumoured to be eyeing ahead of the budget would be something that could be accommodated relatively easily, and there would be plenty of money left over. But that's not the position that we're in. And if anything, defence spending needs to rise going forward. That is a major challenge for the public finances, I think. The notion that we can find an extra 1% of GDP to spend on defence, which is official policy now, following the big NATO summit a few weeks ago, the notion that that can be easily accommodated, well, that's a very big challenge for us. And it is not something that is in the government's projections as of now. They have these 5-year projections, which are produced by the OBR in conjunction with the Treasury. They'll be updated at the budget shortly, and higher defence spending isn't in there. The other big challenge, I think, is on the demand side, and arises from global demographics. And I'm thinking here of the fact that populations are shrinking in a number of key economies, a number of key markets. Populations are also aging, and that's an interesting issue, but I think shrinkage is the key thing. So the population of Japan, for example, is shrinking at a pretty fast rate, something like 1,500 or 2,000 people per day on average. That's how fast the population of Japan is going down. In China, it's far in excess of that. It's more like 15,000 people per day. Now, I know that China is a big place, but that doesn't seem like a trivial number to me. And closer to home, places like Germany and Italy, you've got significant rates of population decline there as well. And that's a challenge for us, because if you are a British company that sells to Japan, for example, well, if you're selling labor-saving devices, maybe you'll be okay, but by and large, if there are going to be fewer people living in Japan, it will be difficult to sell more product into Japan. And whilst the world population is still growing, at a global level, there is still growth. It's a lot slower than it used to be. And I think that helps to explain why rates of economic growth in recent years have been a bit below the level that we used to think was normal. So where do all these challenges leave us? Are we headed for disaster? To listen to some people, that is certainly the case, and some eminent people as well. So I think, for example, of Jamie Dimon, the very eminent and senior American banker, head of JP Morgan. I think of Larry Fink, who heads up the huge asset manager, BlackRock. Both of these guys talked a little earlier in the year in quite apocalyptic terms about the US and its public finances, but they could have been talking about the UK, I think, by extension. And they talked about walls. They talked about hitting a wall. They talked about this thing is going to crack, one of them said. They were pretty uncompromising. I'm not myself persuaded that that's quite the right framing here. I'm not sure that it is helpful to think in terms of hitting a wall or something like that, of encountering a moment of tremendous crisis where things just become unsustainable and the whole system collapses. I think there are other ways that countries and economies can cope. One way is to borrow a lot more money. Some countries have debt to GDP ratios that are well above ours, and that has worked. I don't say that it has worked without causing other challenges, but it's certainly possible. You might end up running higher deficits and just finding that you have to suffer higher inflation as a result. That's one way of doing it also. Or you might find that ultimately there's nothing for it. You have to bite the bullet and raise the tax burden to a relatively high rate by all past standards. None of those are perfect solutions. None of those are very palatable, I don't think, from a centre-right point of view. I don't want to live in a country that is persistently inflation prone, where the debt ratio is edging up in a kind of ominous way, or where the tax burden has risen from where it currently is. I would like to see the tax burden going down, not up. So the challenge then is for us to find ways of growing the economy. That means we don't have to resort to those ways of coping. I think we're going to have some time now to talk about those. Vinny, I'm conscious that I've spoken for a while, and we want to come on to things like energy and housing and capital investment. But why don't I pause there, and perhaps we can address each of those as part of the Q&A with yourself and with others.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for kind of breaking that down systematically and methodically on the problems we face and the challenges we face. But I was just wondering, so Douglas, thank you so much for sharing that. And the last points you raise is, can we borrow more money? That could be an aspect. And of course, we have a centre left and left government right now in Labour in the UK, which looks likely. We could raise the tax burden. And of course, you started with talking about Andy Burnham, and he released his Manchesterism today about where he would like to see the Labour Party grow. And one of the things that was just striking from his statement was it wasn't very clear, but it was talking about nationalisation, in essence, of public services, which means potentially raising the tax burden as another aspect. Where do you think, just talking directly to that point, where do you think Rachel Reeves as the Chancellor is going to raise taxes from? Because like you said, in the 80s, there was a chance to really cut public spending, but that did have its backlash against kind of Thatcher at the time. And I'm not sure, looking at the recent polling, the British public's in the same place. For example, on welfare, a centre-right perspective is to, of course, cut welfare so we can have more growth in the economy. However, if you look at the polling, it looks like the majority of people feel like it's justified to give more welfare to people, and they feel comfortable with the amount and the rising kind of ballooning welfare bill, which is slightly different to how it was 15 years ago. In popular culture, just look at the television, Channel 4, you remember Channel 5, all those documentaries about people on welfare. It's unthinkable to have those documentaries and those kind of mocking documentaries at the moment. So it just shows where public opinion has gone. So on that backdrop, where do you think the money is going to come from for this black hole that Labour have created? And of course, the majority of economists thinks it's going to come from raising the tax burden to further historic highs. And which tax, from your understanding of the Treasury, is that going to come from? And the second point to raise there is, of course, where's the movement for a centre-right party to move into on this backdrop? Where are the policies to move into on those things? We have some other questions coming, but if we can go through those and then we can keep the conversation going.
Yeah. Well, you frame that very well, and I think you're right to highlight the fact that in the 1980s, cutting public spending wasn't universally popular, and ultimately led to a perception that the Conservative government was underspending on public services, and that was one reason why we suffered a very significant defeat in 1997. And behind that fact sits a kind of basic truth of political economy, which is that the public mood shifts when it comes to public spending. Over time, it shifts, and there's the classic poll on this is done by the British Social Attitudes Survey, which asks people something like, do they think taxes should be rising or falling? And they do that every year, and they have done for many years. And you can see that the result is a cycle. It oscillates over time. And the Conservative Party typically has done well at times when the cycle has suggested that people would like taxes to be falling and spending to be falling. And then at times we've preached that message at a time when people want taxes and spending to go up, and then we have suffered electorally. And 1997 was a case in point. Over the past few years, that cycle seems to have ended, and we seem to be plateauing in a world where people are content with high spending and do not see a big reason for it to be reduced. And I was struck this morning just listening to the radio, listening to a Labour MP, the chair of the Business and Select Committee, Liam Byrne, Business and Trade Select Committee, Liam Byrne, who's arguing for support for the JLR suppliers that I mentioned earlier. And he didn't come under any kind of pressure from the interviewer to justify the notion that government money should be spent in that way, which I thought was quite telling. Speaks to a kind of wider belief that government spending is not something that needs to be challenged all that hard. Coming to your point about the outlook for the budget, I think it's clearly highly problematic for the Chancellor, although I would caveat that by saying you never quite know. There are a lot of moving parts in the budget and in the budget preparation process and in the forecast. And we're being invited to believe at the moment that there is this £30 billion black hole. I mean, maybe that's the case. There's some briefing in the papers to say that it is the case, but I would take that with a pinch of salt. So it's not really until rather later in the process that even inside the Treasury, they'll get a good sense of whether the forecast is such as to be causing them real problems. If it is causing them real problems, it's hard to see which way they can easily turn. A lot of instincts on the centre left point you towards things like taxes on capital. But certainly the advice they'll be getting from Treasury officials, I would think, is that the capital gains tax rate is already sufficiently high as to be maximising the overall revenue from that tax. And if you put it any higher, well, people will find ways to avoid it, perhaps quite legally, perhaps just by not realising capital gains, by not selling assets, and your proceeds will go down, not up. There's a lot of talk about a wealth tax. I find that hard to envisage. I think it's very awkward to put in place, very logistically awkward. It couldn't be done in a hurry. It would take quite some time, therefore, to generate revenue.
Why is it awkward to put in place? Because the popular culture right now, if you look at across social media, across the commentators, is yes, the way to go is a wealth tax. And so what would you say if you're in the Treasury right now, and if Rishi Sunak was still Prime Minister, what would you be saying to those arguments? Because they're so popular and they're so contagious in a time of, according to these commentators, high inequality. What would you say to that? Why is it difficult just to push you?
The difficulty is telling how wealthy people are, knowing how wealthy an individual is. It's often supposed out with government that the government has near perfect and universal information about a whole range of things. And that is very often not the case. That's one underappreciated aspect of working in government, I think, that you often don't have nearly as much information as you would like. And wealth is absolutely a case in point. The government doesn't know the value of a person's shareholdings. It doesn't know how much their house is worth. It may have an idea through the council tax system what their house was worth in 1991 when the last revaluation was done, but it doesn't know now. It doesn't know how much debt they might have secured against those assets, and so on. And so to design a system that can collect that information and indeed create that information, it's not just a question of collecting. It might be a question of actually assessing how much a house is worth, or how much a shareholding in a private unlisted company is worth. That's a huge challenge and would involve a great deal of kind of invasive activity. So that is one big reason why I question whether it is possible to operationalize that principle of a wealth tax. I think it'd be fraught with difficulty and would take really a very long time.
People say that instead of having, and I'm going to come to, there's so many questions coming through. So this is the kind of last one for me on that point, because it's such an interesting point right now where they're going to raise revenue from. Is places like Texas, they have very little to say about income tax, but they have high property taxes. And of course, it's difficult to, like you said, calculate how much someone's property is worth. But is there any idea from your understanding on how changing property taxes to raise revenue through that for local governments where a lot of spending is around social care, around education, around special needs education, especially? Is there some idea on that also?
Well, that leads you towards the council tax system, which is the main way that councils fund themselves directly. And the suggestion that's often brought forward there is for some sort of revaluation of the 1991 exercise, and also a kind of addition of a new top band or something like that allows people who own very expensive houses to be charged quite a lot extra in tax. At the moment, those people will be in the top band, and that is not so very far away from the median band, the band in the middle, off which the top and the bottom bands, or the higher and the lower bands, are kind of pegged, off which they are calculated. The difficulty here is that there are not all that many parts of the country where there are a lot of really pricey properties. One thinks immediately of London and Mayfair and places like that. Maybe the more expensive parts of I don't know, some of the other big cities. And so that leads to a problem. If you create a mechanism by which councils can tax big houses, expensive houses, a lot, then that's not much good to the councils that don't have many of that sort of housing stock in their patch. And a simplification to say that it would become a sort of north versus south thing, but that's not a bad way of thinking about it, a generalization. So then you would have to put in place a system that redistributed the council tax that was collected, the extra council tax that was collected in the wealthy areas, or the areas with big houses, and redistribute it to other parts of the country. And I think for a lot of people that would feel a bit unfair. They would feel that they were being taxed only for that revenue to be flowing to another part of the country. And politically, I think that would be quite a big challenge.
Excellent. Thank you so much for answering that. We're going to kind of move on. There's so much we can discuss this. This is a 5-6 hour topic to go into in a lot of detail. But Damian Green, a former MP and a senior member of the Conservative Party, is asking, what's the answer to the consistent low productivity in the UK economy? So that's a big factor about our growth. Like we're just not as productive as other. And can I bring in also the Europeans here? It seems like France runs a very high tax, and it seems like their trade unions are very strong. But looking at the productivity figures, they're more productive than us. So what's going on there? Why are we not as productive as these other countries?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really fundamental issue, and Damien is absolutely right to raise it. Very nice to hear from you, Damien. I hope that you're very well indeed. I think there are a couple of things here. So if we start with the comparisons point, one thing we have done well in the UK is to maintain a fairly high employment rate. And it's better than in many continental countries, and our unemployment rate is better than continental countries as well. So we're running at about 4% at the moment unemployment. In the EU, it is 6%, so it's considerably higher, and that's something of a multi-decade low for the EU. It has oftentimes been considerably higher than that in recent years, even whilst our rate has been lower. And how have we achieved that? Well, part of the reason is that we've done a good job at bringing relatively lowly skilled people into our labour force, into the retail and hospitality sector, for example. And that has a mixed effect. That means that that they have a negative effect on the overall productivity figure, because those industries tend to be relatively low value add. That's not to be critical of them. They're very important parts of the economy and provide a lot of employment and other things. But those jobs are not as high productivity as working in certain areas of high-tech manufacturing or something like that. On the continent, it's harder for low-skilled people to get into the workforce. They have a more rigid labour market, and it is harder for low-skilled labour to prosper in those countries, and so often it remains out with the workforce. And it doesn't therefore come into the productivity figures at all. And that is one reason why in France and some other countries, their productivity numbers look better than ours. But it's the flip side of higher unemployment. And I'm not sure that that is a better way to go. Unemployment's a great evil. And we have been right, I think, to try and minimize unemployment here. On the essence of the question, how can we improve productivity? Why is it not as good? One thing I'll focus on, I think, is energy costs. We've done a great job at decarbonising our energy grid, particularly our electricity generation in recent years. But that has come at a cost. That is clear, and that's been to the disadvantage of a lot of manufacturing industry. And it's manufacturing often where you get the best productivity growth. It's possible to achieve greater levels of automation, for example. I think this is going to change going forward. I'm relatively optimistic here. We've got a lot of renewable electricity generation capacity about to come on stream over the next 5 or 6 years. There'll be a lot of that coming on stream, and I think that is going to be good for energy prices in the UK. And I hope that that's going to give a shot in the arm to our manufacturing sector, and I hope that a knock-on effect of that will be a boost to our productivity performance as well.
Excellent. That's fantastic. That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Damien, for that question and that answer, Douglas. And then John Knights is also talking about how debt should be treated and regarded when it's investment rather than covering the current account. So that's quite interesting. That's an argument also that Rachel Reeves might make, to say that actually it doesn't matter if we're accruing more debt. If we're using that in capital investment, then it's going to pay dividend in the future. What would you say kind of to that argument? It's different how we deal with it.
Yes, well, I would certainly agree that there is a difference between spending for current consumption and spending for investment, and the latter is more economically justifiable and has a much better chance of paying for itself in the long run. If you do it properly, then it certainly should pay for itself in the long run. And the current government has kind of embraced that notion and has changed its headline definition of government debt to this so-called public sector net financial liability measure, which allows a bit more leeway when it comes to borrowing for investment purposes. And I think in principle that's a sensible idea. But I think we've got to be a little bit careful as well. Government investment is often pretty long term, It takes a long time for the benefits to flow through when you're talking about railways or things like that. And there's always a temptation for government ministers to promise a bit more than is realistically deliverable. And so I think we've got to guard against the being too lax in this area, getting too trigger happy when it comes to investment spending. Also because there's an inflation aspect to this. Investment spending is still spending, and it can put upward pressure on the price level if it's taken too far. And you see an example of that actually at the moment in the house building sphere. So the government is quite rightly keen for there to be more houses built, has embraced some deregulatory initiatives to that end. And the idea is that house building will rise to a very high level by past levels, 300,000 houses a year or thereabouts. Now, the Office of Budget Responsibility has done quite a useful study on this and reckons that if we get to that elevated level of house building, a fair chunk of the economic benefit will leach away in the form of higher prices, because this is a relatively high employment economy. I mentioned that point a moment ago. So if you want to move people from one occupation at the moment into house building, well, you're going to have to pay up to persuade them to make that move. You're going to have to pay up so that resources are moved into manufacturing bricks and other building materials. And again, you may have to pay up in order to persuade that resource shift, to cause that resource shift to take place. So we need to be a little bit mindful, I think, of the danger of overdoing it on the investment side. There's definitely a constraint there that we need to bear in mind. And then ultimately as well, I think we can't get away from the fact that debt is debt, even if it's good debt that has been incurred for investment purposes. It still requires the interest to be serviced, and it is still going to contribute to that kind of distributional tension that I mentioned in my opening remarks between taxpayers and bondholders. So we have to keep that in mind as well.
Excellent. Thank you. And I hope that answers that question, John. That's great. Frank Debbie's also asking, so the government, of course, as a Labour government, want to increase public spending, right? It's in their DNA to want to increase public spending, and at times rightly so. But we've seen kind of the best use and the best investment into infrastructure has been when private and public come together to build something, or if the private companies see a profit incentive there, to use that to build well and to then have the public use those facilities and services. They say in Brussels, in Europe, the bet for where the best potential return for additional spending is on transport, infrastructure, clean energy, and now defense, looking at what's going on the eastern border. So what's your view on this side? Where is the best potential return? And so if a firm came to you in the consultancy and said, Douglas, where are we putting our money? Where would you put it?
Yeah, that's a good one. Well, you mentioned transport, and I think that probably stands out for me, at least. I think that if we can create bigger travel to work areas, as they're sometimes called, then that is potentially very helpful indeed, and can boost productivity a lot. It helps matching in the labour market, to use the jargon. In other words, people can find the sort of job that suits them and in which they can perform best and be most productive. And we all know that London is tremendously well off in this regard. Doesn't always feel like it when you're a tube user battling through a tube strike or something, but generally speaking, London's transport system is pretty impressive and creates this huge travel to work area. And we have the possibility to do something similar in the north around Manchester and that whole M62 corridor. And and perhaps in the West Midlands and other places as well. And that doesn't always involve massive cost or massive schemes. One thinks of HS2 perhaps automatically in this space, and that simply hasn't really worked. But there's a lot you can do with your relatively small changes to junctions and improvements to signaling systems and that kind of thing. So I think that's pretty important. So transport is extremely promising. Defense is an interesting one. You mentioned that. Very topical, very important. No doubt in my mind that we need to increase our defense budget, not least because we have promised the Americans that we will. And if we don't, there will be trouble sooner or later. But clearly there's a greater challenge from the East, greater threat from the East than there used to be. Now, for us and for the rest of Europe, a key question is whether that defense spending can be deployed in a way that provides economic benefits as well as security benefits. And I think this one's an ambiguous one at the moment. I'm not sure in my own mind quite which way it's going to go. Traditionally, military spending has often been rather economically marginal because it's essentially unproductive. If you employ an additional soldier, for example, you may be more secure, but he or she is not going to produce more consumer goods. And so in that sense, it's economically unproductive. Now, the counterpoint is that in the US in particular, they've done a great job down the years of using military spending to stimulate technological innovation. The US Department of Defense has this massive research budget, and that is one reason why America has been so good in basic and advanced research down the years, all the way from the space program to lots of other things. So it may be that if we can find a way of channeling increased UK and European defence spending into R&D, there will be benefits. Some of it you would think will go to some of our quite highly productive advanced manufacturing companies, BAE Systems and so on, and that's promising. There's a risk that a lot of it flows abroad, of course, to the States. We are very reliant on America for a lot of our military hardware, and I think that will continue to be the case for even if we are building up the European supply base. So we've got to try and manage that balance as well. And it is a balance because whilst we want to spend some of that money in Europe, we have promised the Americans that we will spend more on their kit as well. That's a concomitant part of the trade deals that we've struck recently. So there's a balance to be managed there. So defence is a potentially very interesting one, but there are quite a few complications there.
Excellent. So many points I want to raise from that, but in the interest of time, we'll keep moving. But talking about HS2 and talking about just recently, Mark is saying that the plans to extend high-speed rail across the north have been delayed further because of rising costs. So why are we so slow compared to other countries in Europe around the world in building things? For example, let me quickly read out something from a report called the Foundations Report, and it came out a year ago or so, and it says, and this is just a summary, energy prices for industry tripled between 2004 to 2021, yet we produce far less electricity per person than France or the US. We haven't built a nuclear plant since the 1980s, a reservoir since 1992, or a tram in Leeds, while France has built 21 trams in smaller cities. HS2 costs 4 to 8 times more per mile comparable to European projects, and Heathrow's capacity has barely shifted in 2 decades. Even just planning a tunnel under the Thames costs more than Norway spent actually building the world's longest road tunnel. The system makes everything slower, costlier, and harder until we fix that. So what is it? What is the rate limiting step, as we say in chemistry, that's blocking us to build faster and just build the infrastructure we need?
Mm. I think population density is part of the answer. This is a pretty small and relatively densely populated island, and particularly in places like the north, all the way across from Liverpool to Hull, and that's true of the south as well. And that's less true of some continental peer countries. So I think that's part of the answer. Um, I think it's clear that we've got an accretion of law and regulation that has become counterproductive and needs to be hacked back, and that's been accepted by governments of both parties for quite some time now. It's proved harder in practice, I think, to actually do the hacking back, and it's it's difficult to know exactly why that is. But I think a broad point is that you're always taking on some lobby group or other if you go after a particular regulation. And the kind of nature lobby is a case in point here, not to single them out particularly. But people often talk quite dismissively about bat tunnels and newts and this kind of thing. There are a lot of people, believe it or not, who care a lot about stuff like that, and whose political influence is not to be dismissed. On the nuclear side, just to dwell on that for a moment, for sure, nuclear is going to be an important part of our energy mix going forward. As it always has been, it's declined a little bit in recent years as some of our generation capacity has come offline, and that's going to happen a bit more over the next few years before things like Hinkley Point and Sizewell C come on stream, and perhaps the small modular reactors in which a lot of faith is being placed. On that point, I will just say that nuclear energy construction costs are very high, and only ever seem to get higher. And the industry has a terrible record of promising a particular construction cost and then running way over budget. And that's certainly been true of Hinkley Point. And I fear that we may not have seen the last of that phenomenon. I just offer that caveat, having looked at that question a few times in government. The nuclear sector is sometimes its own worst enemy when it comes to inspiring confidence amongst policymakers that it really can deliver for the agreed price.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that on population density and law and regulation. I guess a takeaway for people watching is diving deeper into which laws and regulation will unlock this kind of growth or the speed of how we develop infrastructure. And one thing that I'm interested in is the very geeky policy wonk level stuff. I'm sorry, but the 1947 kind of Town and Planning Act about housing and how that came into account. So that's further reading for everyone on the call. The final question by Penelope Lennon, who's the chair here of the Conservatives in Oxford, the Oxford Federation, as it were. She talks about Andy Burnham, of course, talking today about how we should ignore the bond market, but he didn't say that when it happened to Liz Truss and when we had this kind of problem with the bond market at that time because of the policies she enacted with her chancellor at the time. I guess another point here, the deeper point she's raising is the majority of the population, I'm in healthcare, there's so much asymmetric information between me as the clinician and the patient. In the same way, there's so much asymmetric information between kind of economists and people in the Treasury that used to be there like yourself and the general population. But people like Margaret Thatcher in the 80s, as you mentioned, she cut through by talking about it in very sensible and digestible terms, in the terms of the sensible housewife, which everyone can remember. And so what can you think of anything that would cut through for the centre right as a last question on framing how we do economic policy? And if there were three things that you would advise the Conservative Party right now to focus on economy and trade, what three things would they be? What would you be telling the Conservative Party and the centre-right parties across Europe? What three things should you be focusing on in terms of economy and trade? Not just for framing, but in terms of the longer growth strategy of our countries.
Mm, mm. Well, Penelope, thanks for the question, and you're quite right. Yeah, Andy Burnham was singing a different tune when Liz Truss was trying to not be in hock to the bond market. It's an important point. This I think communicating about economics is difficult. It can be quite a technical and in some senses a kind of counterintuitive subject. You end up with some counterintuitive conclusions sometimes, and for people who are not highly trained in the discipline, that can be difficult. And I think that's probably true of other policy areas as well, perhaps. I don't think it's unique to economics. Maggie was great at it, and it's probably true to say that there's been no one as good as her since then. Although, people like Tony Blair and David Cameron were masterful communicators as well. I mean, you've just got to try and keep things simple, I suppose, is the key question, or the key kind of objective. If you can relate it to everyday things that people recognize, credit card bills or mortgage payments or things like that, then that can help. But perhaps beyond all that, before you get to all that, you've got to have a kind of a narrative, an insight that is correct and in which you really believe. It doesn't matter if that is conceptually complicated at first, because you can always, with a bit of time and effort, you can always boil it down to something that's a bit more simple and punchy. So I think that's maybe the answer. Not to focus too much on the comms. That comes afterwards. It's the substance that comes first, and that brings me then to the second part of your question about three priorities. So I think the first thing that I would emphasize is fiscal responsibility. It's prudence. It's respecting the bond markets. It is respecting the need to live within our means. To me, that is very much at the core of a centre-right approach to the world. When we as a party have forgotten that, we've gotten into dreadful trouble. And I fear that is something that the Labour Party doesn't appreciate as well as we do, and it is in the process of forgetting or trying to ignore. But there's definitely a political space there, because reform is not in that space at all, as far as I can see. They are firmly in the realm of fiscal fantasy. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that we need to be confident in what I think is another of our central beliefs, which is that we should always look for ways for the state to do less, not more. And that doesn't mean that the state shouldn't do anything. There are lots of things that only the state can do, and it should be properly resourced to do those things. But we should always be looking for ways in which things can be done by the private sector and by the third sector. And then the third thing that for me is perhaps the big challenge, the central challenge for the centre right is if we want to get public spending down, or even keep it growing more slowly than it has done recently, then that is going to be very, very difficult. That's a real challenge. You talked earlier, Vinay, about getting into the detail of the Town and Country Planning Act and things like that. And it's equally true of government spending, because virtually every line item is benefiting someone somewhere. It's very difficult to find something that has really outlived its usefulness and which no one will care if it is abolished. And so it isn't enough just to talk in general terms about the desirability of reducing public spending, or talk about cutting waste or old standbys like that. If we are actually going to make it happen, then it requires an awful lot of really detailed, really painstaking work. And that, I think, is where a lot of energy on the centre right ought to be directed in the years ahead. That, for me, is our biggest challenge.
Excellent. That was brilliant to end off with, and we want to thank you, Douglas, so much for taking out your time to share your insights on economy and trade with us here at the Ideas Network. And we want to thank everyone for tuning in today and taking out your Wednesday evening, even though the weather from 6 to 7, you can see the sun coming through where I am in the southeast. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I guess the kind of message to end with is, I think for the centre right now, we want to avoid what the centre left are going through right now, not having a clear plan and a clear narrative. So it's time to get to work. There's a lot of painstaking work to do, and someone's got to do it. So I think people on this call that have given up their time are definitely in the right position. So thank you so much, Douglas, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope to see you in around a month's time or so. Please make sure your emails are in your primary folder so you don't miss an announcement. We've got some very exciting further panelists joining us on different topics in the coming months. So hope to see you then, and have a great evening.